I've always been a champion of African art forms, and I think it's when I was involved in African history study, I had this recollection of seeing these instruments as a young person, and this was one of the ones that was, how can I say it, was created in the diaspora of Africa. Africans were taken to another place and to kind of reinvent their culture in this other place. The steel drums arose out of that. The islands, the Caribbean islands, were one part of a triangle of moving goods and people and spices around. So Africans were brought to Trinidad, which is the southernmost island in the Caribbean chain, in the 1600s to work in sugarcane plantations mostly, but they, had other things that they took the slaves to use, other work and labors kind of things, but the sugarcane plantations was the big draw. So slaves in Trinidad would try to keep as much of their culture as they could, and drumming was part of what was the most valuable, one of the most valuable things in the culture. It was communication, it was entertainment, it was connecting with the roots, it was connected with celebrations and whatever happy times people could have. So at one point, when Africans were using drums to celebrate or communicate, it became a frightening situation for the Europeans because they could see Africans were getting very excited around drumming activities. So as a result of no skin drums being allowed, Africans picked up whatever they could find in their environment to continue their drumming traditions, and this included metal objects, gin bottles, spoons, garbage cans came in at some point as a thing to make sound. As African men played their drumming sounds on containers, and they would compete with each other for the loudest sound. They would get a bigger stick if you had to have a bigger stick, or you would play harder your metal container. So eventually that container would hammer in to a concave shape, but it would lose its rackety sound because the metal now had been twisted a bit. So the Africans would go back from the bottom side of that container and try to push it back out to make it more flat so it could have a loud sound. And someone found out that these different facets of trying to reconstruct that flatness of the drum gave different sounds, different pitches. And that kind of gave the birth to the idea that that surface could be manipulated for tonal value. The first surfaces were very rough, but they did have different sounds. It was not intentioned to be very musical. But the first one that was musical was a convex shape with about 4 little knots knocked up with a broomstick. And each one of those little dome shapes had a different pitch. The original steel band groups, or steel drum groups, were like rude boys. They were in these different enclaves, and the youth had no work, and they were suffering poverty, so they really latched onto these drumming groups as identification with their local areas, but also as a place to belong, because they had nowhere to fit. Socially, he was a little different because he had more things going for him. He wasn't completely African, so his background lended him to being able to go to schools and things like that. But steel drum was probably something that his background would have never wanted him to approach. But he got stung like many people did. He had great musical sense. As a boy 14, he joined into the movement, and he brought his own personal ideas and his own desire. He wanted to see the instrument, once it became an instrument, to have more status than it had at the time. Tuning techniques is what has made him world-renowned. His instruments are, he's the Stradivarius of the movement, without a doubt. And he's very pivotal. He was also the very first one to make a concave drum. Previous to him, all things were convex, or dome shaped. So he did the concave drum, which he discovered that if you could hammer the drum into a concave surface, he could stretch the working area. You could put more notes by stretching the area that way. And until the advent of the musical sound came in, where people found out that these young men were actually really trying to pursue something very unique. The world had never seen. The culture latched onto it. Women came in, I think in around the maybe mid-60s, because they weren't allowed as proper females to be around this stuff. But when it developed and became embraced by the culture in whole, not only the culture of men, women were allowed to come in. Why? Because women studied in school, and they were the people who knew music. So they actually brought in composition, arrangement, ideas, because they had the training. The men didn't. The men drumming, come up with rough musical ideas, whatever they could hear on British radio or something, but the instruments weren't up to playing those kind of classical things or whatever they heard. But when women came in, they brought this arrangement sense and this melodic sense that the men didn't have, and they really added something, I think it was in the mid-60s, to the movement.